Welcome to Live from Plato's Cave. I am Mario Veen. This is episode 15, Bernard Stiegler's Philosophy with Daniel Ross. In Plato's allegory of the cave, one of the prisoners is freed and dragged up to the surface, where they have some original insight. But when they return to the cave, their message does not reach the people who are still there. There are a lot of ways to interpret this part of the allegory, and we have already discussed some of them in other episodes. But the most literal interpretation is that Plato was a philosopher and a student of Socrates, and he writes the allegory after Socrates was put to death for impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens. As we will discuss in this episode, Athens at that time was in a crisis, and Socrates was questioning some basic assumptions of the establishment. So, when Plato writes that the people in the cave don't listen to the returning soul, he might be alluding to how philosophy is often not heard in society, and particularly when that society is in a crisis. We could ask ourselves, which philosophers today are not heard or not heard enough? And what would happen if we studied them, tried to understand them, no matter how strange and complex their message seems at first? This is what we are going to try today. From my perspective, Bernard Stiegler is one of those philosophers. We already discussed Stiegler in 2 previous episodes, with Dominic Patman in episode 10 and with Peter Lemmens in episode 11. While Stiegler's work is extremely complex, it is also directly about what we are experiencing today. And by that I mean the accelerating evolution of technology, a crisis of attention, climate change, the idea that we are living in a post-truth world where facts don't seem to matter anymore. It seems like knowledge is replaced with information, which, as Stiegler writes, is the very opposite of knowledge. Ironically, Stiegler's work is not yet widely known. Many of his books are still unpublished in English, and the books that are published are not read enough. Our guide today is trying to change that. Daniel Ross obtained his doctorate from Monash University in 2002. He is the author of Violent Democracy and of Psychopolitical Anaphylaxis, Steps Towards the Metacosmics. He is also the co-director with David Barrison of the feature documentary The Istar, which premiered at the Rotterdam International Film Festival in 2004 and which won awards in Montreal and Marseille. Through that film, he met Bernard Stiegler and published 11 volumes of translation of Stiegler's work, and at the moment is working on other translations as well. For instance, the Nanjing Lectures, and the collective volume by Stiegler and the International Collective entitled Bifurcate, There is No Alternative. These books too are published with Open Humanities Press, which means that you can download them for free online, as should be the case with all academic work actually. Okay, let's start then. Thanks very much for speaking with me today about Stiegler's work and your own work and the relationship between those works. I think we met once, must be 20 years ago, during a screening of The Istar in Amsterdam.
Yes, I can't really remember it, to be honest, but it was quite some time ago, maybe in Rotterdam?
Yeah, it was in Rotterdam or in Amsterdam. It was with Dominic Patman, who I talked to a few episodes ago.
Well, the film premiered in Rotterdam.
Yeah.
But I went to Amsterdam during that trip, so it's possible, but I think it would have been Rotterdam.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Yeah, and The Istar is kind of a cult movie, I think, in philosophy spheres. Most people who are interested in, for instance, Heidegger have seen it. It's a philosophical road movie. But speaking of roads and traveling, I was kind of reading, because I don't really know you, except that I met you then. And then when I started reading more of Stiegler's work, I noticed, translated by Daniel Ross, was there a lot. And I read some of your introductions and everything. but when I started looking you up on the internet, I saw that you started out studying physics. Is that correct?
It is, but only for a short time. But it's what I initially wanted to do when I first went to university, and for a long time before that. And my interest in that at that time really was because it seemed to me that what physics tells you is that to understand the very largest scale, you must also understand the very smallest scale, and vice versa. And that this is true in space. If you want to understand the way that galaxies unfold and so on, you need to understand not just that the universe was smaller, but you need to understand about the subatomic particles and forces. And if you want to understand those subatomic particles and forces and where they came from, you need to understand the first few seconds of time after the Big Bang. And so this connection between the largest and the smallest scales and time and space seemed to me to be something incredible and worth knowing more about. But within a short amount of time, I realized that I wasn't going to be smart enough to make any advances in these questions, and maybe not even smart enough to really understand them. But it was always an interest that I kept, even though I then made the decision to get out and do something completely different.
Yeah, and I guess we'll talk about this later. But Stiegler uses concepts from physics like entropy. I guess you still have some use of your knowledge of physics and skill. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So how did you switch to philosophy? What was your interest? I mean, I guess when you put it like that, that already sounds like a philosophical attitude, the relationship between different skills.
Yes, but it's still a little bit of a few steps had to go to get from one to the other. Where I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Melbourne, at that time in the 1980s, the philosophy departments were very much dominated by analytical philosophy, and there wasn't much continental philosophy there. So to find it, you had to look around in other places. But even so, it wasn't my overwhelming interest in the beginning. And as I was there, and with Dominic Petman at that time, we were undergraduates together, we started to fall into anthropology subjects together. And I think maybe that's how I met him. And I became more and more interested in anthropology, and I almost became an anthropologist. But in the year when I was doing my honors degree, or just before that, Derrida published a book about Marcel Mauss and the gift. And this book caused me to feel that there was ways of pursuing anthropological questions that I couldn't just do in anthropology. And so then I started to feel like I needed to move towards something like philosophy, although in fact the PhD that I did was in the Department of Political Science at Monash University, but the supervisor that I had, a guy called Michael Yanova, was pretty close to a philosopher himself, and a very wise guy. And he gave me the space to do what I wanted to do, which then in fact shifted away from directly being about the Derrida, Mauss, Georges Bataille questions that occupied me in that thesis, and became more and more interested in Heidegger. And why that occurred partly was because I felt that, and in some way I think it's perhaps unfair to Derrida, but I felt at that time that in some way questions of temporality and history get suspended in his work. He assumes them, he takes them on board from Heidegger and others, but somehow they become sterilized in his work and everything starts to become a little bit timeless. Whereas in Heidegger, I felt there was an attempt to pursue the question of temporality very far, and it seemed important not to give that up.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, it's not a surprise that I would land on Stiegler, even though that's another story of one accident upon another.
Like Peter Lemmens also said that he accidentally came upon the work of Stiegler, and that seems to be quite a theme in there. But just to do some housekeeping for people who are not familiar with all those names. So Derrida is a philosopher who writes about language, language, speech, writing a lot, right? And the relationship to time. And George Bataille is, I don't really know him so well. So how would you summarize his interest?
He was a very unusual man who, in fact, for a long time was a librarian in Paris, but knew people like Walter Benjamin and many other people. But he was very much a kind of French Nietzsche, but in the 20th century, who identified himself with Nietzsche, but not only with the transgressive Nietzsche, but also with the Nietzsche of genealogy of morals. And so he was also a reader of Mauss and anthropology, and in particular in relation to the idea of the gift, which is a fundamental notion in anthropology of gift exchange, but in some way radicalized that idea with his own economic theory, let's call it that, in a book called The Accursed Share, which is a very interesting book that tries to think what is the distinction of the economy of the kinds of beings that we are, human beings, in a way that's not like the circuits of life of other living things.
Yeah, so economy, not just in the sense of financial transactions, but also, I guess, social transactions, energy transactions, right? So a very broad understanding of economy and human relationships.
Yes, and really starting from the sun, or the idea of
which is a great connection to Plato's cave, right? Yeah, the sun has an unlimited amount of energy. So why would be quite interesting in this time where we're very focused on conserving energy. I think he's saying the opposite, like use it as much as possible, spend energy.
Yeah, what he's saying is complex, because it's not that to me, it's not that he's saying you should expend as much energy as possible. It's that he's saying you have no choice, in the sense that whatever calculated economy you create, there'll be something that overflows that. There'll be a surplus energy, and you have to make use of it, but you can't make use of it usefully. But nevertheless, you have to make use of it, because if you don't make use of it, you'll make use of it destructively. So it's a kind of a paradox of energy. I think that you can never escape this need for a kind of luxuriant expenditure, but at the same time, it's a dangerous expenditure.
Because if you don't use that energy, it can start to turn into violence, for instance.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
It can produce a reaction, and so then you can connect it to questions of, in his time, the rise of fascism and the rise of populism in general, and the phenomena of scapegoating and so on.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, that's George Bataille. And then Derrida was also studying Heidegger and I guess gave a different take to it. And then Stiegler was a student of Derrida, studied Derrida and built on his work, right?
Yes, he wrote to Derrida when I think he was still in prison, and didn't expect to hear back, because he felt, when you're a prisoner, you can't rely on the outside world. They're not going to help you. But nevertheless, Derrida wrote back, supervised him, and they were very close. Of course, there are many Derridean scholars in the world. And it seems to me that most of them studiously avoid reading Stiegler.
Yeah.
Or commenting on his work. And perhaps they feel that Stiegler was somehow an unfaithful son. But I don't think that that's the case at all. Obviously, I have a completely different perspective on it. For me, the only way to be faithful is to take another step.
Yeah. Yes.
As far as I'm concerned, from my position in philosophy, what I feel and have felt for a long time is that he is the one who took a step.
Yeah. Stiegler also writes about, in Technics and Time, he writes about critique. And I think he writes somewhere that, I mean, there's an idea that critique is kind of dismissing something, but he says critique is actually showing respect for something, because you describe, he says an object, but it could be the work of a philosopher, it could be something else, and you describe it, its necessity, but you also describe its limits. And I guess that's where it gets tricky when you respect. I mean, personally, if I don't like something, if I read a work of a philosopher or something, if I don't like something, I don't feel I should invest any more energy in it. I wouldn't critique that, because I think, I have limited amount of time. I better read a philosopher that I agree with to a certain point, but actually it makes me think, it makes me take another step. And so I think there's a different understanding of critique in that sense in philosophy, right? As a kind of a respect for a work, but in order to respect it, you also, it's not enough to just become, let's say, a disciple of Derrida or of Stiegler or of Heidegger. I think Heidegger also said something like to his students, like, don't Heidegger. You shouldn't be Heideggering. Just read my work, okay, but then do your own thing, right?
Right, of course. A critique is never a denunciation. And what you say is totally true. It's a question of investment. A critique is an investment in the work in the work that you are critiquing. And to invest, you have to have a reason to invest. And a reason is not just a logical reason, but a reason in the sense of a motive and a desire. And for Stiegler himself, the connection between reason understood as a form of intellectual work, let's call it, of reasoning, is always connected with the question of the reason for investing in that work. And that investment is an expenditure of energy, exactly as you say. So always the question comes back to energy.
Yeah. Energy. And you also use the word desire, because I guess there's something, if you read a book, I mean, I just finished one book of Stiegler in 2 weeks, which I don't recommend, but it takes a lot of energy. But then I guess I do it because there's something I desire. I want to, for instance, I want to understand something. That could be something, right? Or I want to get clarity on something.
Well, maybe I should say something about the position of desire in Stiegler's work.
Yeah, please.
Because, for instance, it is a difference between him and Derrida in the place that desire has, the central place that it has in his work. So maybe I'll just say some things about how I see Stiegler's work in general. And some of them might repeat a little bit what Peter said in one of your earlier episodes, but I think we can add to that on this question. So, a lot of the time when people talk about Bernard Stiegler, they call him a philosopher of technology. And I don't do that. I call him a philosopher of memory. And that's because what really matters to him is not the fact that the kind of beings that we are create technology. What matters to him, or artifacts, let's say, or as he calls it, organized inorganic matter, or as he also calls it, the pursuit of life by means other than life. What matters is that that when you create an artifact, you create a kind of a memory. This goes back a couple of million years, something like that, and it's not intended at all when it first begins to occur as a repository of memory in any way. It's intended to pursue life. In other words, to make a tool, the idea, the dream, the picture has to arise somehow of the benefit that you're going to be able to get, the animal that you're going to be able to kill, the meat that you're going to be able to cut up, etc., etc. So you could then ask the question, so that means that somebody had to picture it in their head, right? And that's a very easy and obvious step to take, because if the creation of a tool, especially for the first time, is something that has never happened before, then in some way there's a imagination of what does not exist that then becomes something that does exist. And doesn't that therefore mean that it first arises in the brain? Now, what Stiegler says is that this is not the right way to look at it, because the rate at which this development of one tool to another, or the development of the sophistication of tools, is so slow, the evolution of tools is so slow at that beginning time, that it occurs at the same rate as the evolution of the pre-human brain. Because we're not talking about human beings here, we're not talking about Homo sapiens. And if that's the case, then it becomes difficult to say whether it's the brain that's picturing things and changing the tools, or whether it's the tool that functions as a kind of mirror, which by reflection over the course of hundreds of thousands of years leads to the brain changing. Now, what that really means is that with those changes in the evolution of tools and of the brain, there is a kind of suspension of the programs of behavior that existed in the pre-human, the primates prior to this. So that in this suspension begins and then begins to grow, because these tools mean that life, even though it's very slowly doing so, begins to change in terms of the behaviors that need to be developed to follow this. So there becomes a disconnection from biology.
So just to make sure I understand that part, I can imagine, okay, let's say you start with a flint and making a flint into a sharp object, which could be kind of a rudimentary knife to kill an animal. But then maybe you start to throw stones, or they're already throwing stones, but you find out that if you connect this flint to a stick, actually you have a spear. And but in order to have that in your society, you need to kind of organize your society around it, because you need to be good at throwing it. I mean, it's an Olympic sport right now. Is it called spear throwing, or it's probably called something else? Yeah. So these are kind of skills that you then need to develop in your society. And there will be people that are very good at that. You can practice it. But there are also people who are good at making the spears, and there are people who are good at preparing the meat and everything like that. So kind of the society changes, and also what becomes important in that society?
Right. Even maybe you can't use the word society.
Society, yeah, I heard myself saying it, but yeah.
But what you're describing is the necessity of an education of some kind.
Yeah.
In other words, a transmission between generations that reproduces and slowly changes the lessons that have been learned about how to live with artifacts, and can no longer be timeless lessons, even though for the vast expanse of that time, the perception was that these are timeless lessons.
Yeah.
That things don't change.
You need to do the same things as your father and your grandfather. Right. And until not so long ago, this was pretty much the way of thinking. If your father is a peasant, the chances are that your grandfather was one too, and that you will be one too, and your children will be one too. And this is completely different now.
Right. And what does now mean in this case? It really means since the change of the technical system that brought the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah. Okay.
Because this is when the acceleration begins, when it starts to seem that, okay, my children need to learn other lessons than I learned.
Yeah.
And that acceleration continues. But to go back to what I was saying before, so the question then becomes, where does thinking occur? If we call it noesis, let's say, thinking, if it doesn't occur in brains, where does it occur? This is a very unusual question. But it's crucial. And it's crucial to avoiding the traps of what Heidegger called metaphysics, even though he didn't say it in this way. But Husserl was a philosopher who was before Heidegger, for whom the question of where are the ideas was a real question as well. And what Stiegler says is that we have to ask this question because it's in the dynamic between our artifacts and the evolution of our artifacts and our minds and our societies and the evolution of our minds and our societies. It's in between those places that thinking really occurs. In other words, if you don't have those artifacts, you can't think those thoughts. As an example that he gives in one of his books, there are many, many societies that never thought the concept of 1,000. Very few did. And what made it possible to think the concept of 1,000 was the representation of what 1,000 means in symbolic form, in other words, in writing, diagrams and writing.
I think we can picture only like 3, 4, 5. I think 5 is maybe the maximum, right?
1, 2, 3, a lot.
Yeah.
That's normal. Even though you think, well, 10 is so natural. Okay, but nothing really is natural. What is natural for us? Nothing. And so, if you accept the idea that the evolution of techniques brings about a kind of suspension of programs, of behavioral programs, which are themselves forms of memory that are transmitted genetically. And if you accept that, what replaces that is a evolution of thinking that doesn't just occur in brains, and you can never think about it as just occurring in brains, then you have a way of taking a step past those debates that have occupied 2,000 years of philosophy between idealism and materialism, or transcendentalism and empiricism. It's a step. For me, it's a real step.
Which in a nutshell, that would be, does knowledge come from thinking, or does it come from examining the world out there? That's, I mean, I'm simplifying it a lot, but is that kind of the difference that the debate is? Like in Plato's cave, you would need to go first to the world outside of this world, to the world of forms. Remember that?
Right.
Socrates interrogates or asks questions, and then by those questions you remember the knowledge that you already have in your mind, and through that knowledge you can have wisdom in society. And another way would be that you need to do, let's say, you need to do science, you need to do experiments, you need to learn from experience, from talking to people, from looking at, well, we had a whole episode about, is the earth round or flat? Well, the way you find out about that is to do experiments and to trust your senses.
And another way to think about it in the history of philosophy would be to say, okay, idealism is a very strong idea. Philosophy. Say in modern philosophy, Kant and Hegel have very good arguments for saying that you have no access to anything except through ideas.
Yeah.
You don't have direct access. You only have access through the apparatus of ideas that makes it possible for you to apprehend. And Karl Marx comes along and says, this is upside down. Because like Stiegler, he says that it's the evolution of the material forces, in other words, technology, that makes it possible for those ideas to arise, not the other way around.
Yeah.
What Stiegler will say is, this is still an opposition that Karl Marx is living in here between ideas and matter. And what he forgets, or what he doesn't know, or doesn't recognize, is what you can see in Plato, the idea that the artifact is a memory, not just matter. It's a retention. It keeps something in it. And because it keeps something in it, it is the source of ideas, as materialism will say, but it's also where we project our ideas onto. And so matter is not just matter. It's what Stiegler will call hypermatter. But in any case, putting the philosophy to one side for a minute, if it's true what I say, that Stiegler is a philosopher of memory, not of technology, of retention, then this is not just because we can store knowledge in books and cave paintings and even in flint tools that were not designed to keep knowledge, but nevertheless accidentally do so. The significance of it is not just that it keeps the knowledge, but that it becomes the source of new projections. In other words, new dreams and new desires. So going back to what we said about the very first tools, that you had to dream a possibility, a new world that could come if you had this artifact, what you could do. You had to have a picture in your mind of something that doesn't exist, but that could become real. Then this is always a question of the relationship to the future, which means a question of anticipation, of expectation, and of desire, and of reason. So technics is not just a question of memory, it's always a question of the relationship between memory and desire. And it is the history, the changing history of those techniques of memory that produces a changing history of the techniques of the liberation of desire, the control of desire, or the destruction of desire. And what Stiegler really argues is that for a very long time, the techniques of memory that prevailed, especially in the West, in what you could call is the Western process of individuation, the techniques of memory that prevailed was writing. And writing produced all kinds of negative and positive possibilities. And it produced the world of the Industrial Revolution, and it produced, therefore, the world of Karl Marx. But what Karl Marx didn't see was that the techniques of memory, and he didn't see it because for him, techniques isn't firstly a question of memory, would continue to change. After his death, you have the invention of the telegraph, the gramophone, the radio, the cinema, the television, and the computer. All of these are techniques of memory. All of them produce great transformations of the way in which society is organized to live with these techniques. But they also, and fundamentally, lead to new processes and ways of generating, producing, controlling, and destroying desire. And the 20th century is the century of the learning by capitalism of how to take control of desire, because the real energy of capitalism is not just what you get from the steam engine, it's the libidinal energy that is the driver of what Max Weber called the spirit of capitalism. But in taking control of this energy, strangely enough, it depletes and undermines the same energy, and therefore depletes and undermines the conditions of its own existence. And that's the real contradiction at the heart of 20th century capitalism.
Yeah. So capitalism, the intention is that we all can have a 4-hour work week and enjoy the benefits of all the abundance that we have and live in luxury. I think maybe that's kind of an ideal, and everybody can make it. So no matter where you are born, you can be, if you just work hard enough, if you use the skills that you have, you can have success in this world. But at the same time, if we look around us now, then okay, so there's first the desire for objects. So first there's a desire maybe for food, and capitalism is a system that can make sure that people have food, but then you also get other things like cigarettes or something like that. So people start to have desires for something that they didn't picture in their mind, and now capitalism provides it. But now it's another question where the desire is not even, you don't even get a cigarette. It's just trying to maximize the time that you spend on Facebook. Kind of an economy of desire where, yeah.
The key point that you made is the last one, amount of time. The real question of capitalism is a question of time. It used to be that society was organized on the idea of a timeless foundation, which was a theological foundation. And of course is very unjust world, etc., etc. But in that world, there was the idea of an infinity, and that for a class of people, it was necessary for them to be liberated from those questions of subsistence that you mentioned, getting enough food, and which, as soon as you have artifacts, the question of organizing hierarchies is unavoidable. You have, that is the beginning of the division of work into the division of society and the division of work.
Like the person who makes the spear and the person who throws it and the person who prepares the food.
Right. And the shaman and the priest and so on. And so and the
person who teaches others how to do all those things because he's good at teaching.
Right. And the person who can't, as Woody Allen said, the person who isn't good at teaching teaches sport. But before capitalism, you had monasteries, and those monasteries are a space where it is possible to devote time to those infinite things beyond the finite needs of subsistence, contemplation of God. And this is the difference between otium and negotium. Otium is that time that is free to pursue the real work. And negotium is the time that is not that is the time of subsistence. And that is the word from which we get negotiation, business, etc. Yeah. What capitalism is from the beginning is the idea that negotium should conquer otium, that the time of business should progressively eat into every space of free time.
Because free time is then seen as time where you don't produce anything, basically wasted time.
Right, and this is what Max Weber talks about, and talks about the difficulty of that in the beginning of capitalism, because there was the idea that, well, if we pay higher wages, people will work harder. But in fact, the discovery was you pay them more, they they will want to work less because they have got what they need for the life that they want to live, and prefer to keep their time rather than to gain. And a lot of work had to be done by capitalism to create the new spirit, as Weber calls it, the new spirit that wants to always devote every minute to productivity. And in that is 19th century story. But in the 20th century, that conquest continues, and it continues into what people think of as leisure time. But leisure time is not free time, because leisure time is that becomes the new market that is conquered. And this is the beginning of the transformation of capitalism. That means that it's focused less on the production of goods that meet the needs of subsistence, and far more focused on the production of consumer life, the life of leisure time, and conquering that time. In other words, transforming the desire of consumers to want to fill it with the products of capitalism.
Yeah.
And how does it do that? Through the memory technologies that have developed in the 20th century, that is radio and television.
Yeah. Okay, well, we've gotten quite deep into the philosophy and of techniques of the philosophy of memory, as you say. Can we will come back to it, but because I'm still interested in how you came from physics to philosophy to Heidegger in a political department. So your PhD thesis was about Heidegger and politics. And I saw some quotations, some references to Stiegler in your PhD thesis. And I think that was also the time that you made the ISTER, right? So how did that happen?
Okay, well, the thesis that I did, that I ended up doing, was about two of the courses given by Heidegger. The 1924 course on Plato's Sophist, and a lot of that is also about Aristotle, and which is a very interesting course, which for a long time was not published even in German. But there were reports of the content of this, especially in terms of what it said about Aristotle and Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, and how that translates into Heidegger's own work was subject of many papers that had been, and books that had been written prior to my PhD. And then those guesses got to be tested by the appearance of the work itself. And it seemed to me that the lecture course was far deeper and more interesting than all of the guesses about how Aristotle corresponds to Heidegger. But the reason I mention it is because a lot of those guesses were to say that Heidegger really has a fixation with Sophia, with the timeless wisdom, etc., etc. But it's really not the case. The whole of the lecture course is a rumination, or a whole of that long part of the lecture course, on the relationship between those different virtues. And it's not at all the case that Dasein somehow has this bias towards this ontological virtue in Aristotle. That's how it seems to me. Not everybody got it totally wrong, but the people who wanted to link Heidegger's thought to his Nazism mostly got it wrong. That's how I felt at the time. And the other lecture course that I looked at was the one from 1942, which happens to be the one on the Easter, Hölderlin's poem. And then a friend of mine, David Barrison, proposed, I won't tell the whole story, but he proposed making a film together related to philosophy. And I came up with this idea of going to Europe and making this film around this poem. It's true what you say, that there are references to Stiegler in that PhD, but I would say that at the time that I was working on the PhD, I didn't understand Stiegler. I didn't understand that he really took a step. I saw him as a really good reader of Derrida and Heidegger. But why did I have that limitation? I had it because, like many of the people who still read Stiegler today, they only know about philosophy. But to read Stiegler, you have to know about André Lerard-Goron, you have to know about Bertrand Gilles. At that time, nobody knew about Gilbert Simondon, nobody that I knew.
All these French thinkers, right? Because the first volume of Technics and Time, the second part is a lot about Heidegger, but the first part is a lot about these anthropologists and these kind of philosophical anthropologists. Yeah, archaeologists. Yes.
Yeah. And I was one of those people who went straight for the philosophy.
Yeah.
I didn't give enough consideration, because it's in that first part where you can see where he takes a new step. It was, I'll explain the story of when I recognized that this was not enough. After we made the film, we were invited to Marseille. And in Marseille, Stiegler was also invited, and for a screening of the film.
And you interview him in the film, and we haven't mentioned that, but you interview him in the film.
And he's really the star of the film for me. He gives a great performance. He was really, at that time, he knew exactly what he was doing and how to do it. And he made the film. The film, the Easter would not be the Easter without Stiegler. It would be, and he was incredibly generous as well. Everybody else said, okay, anybody else in this movie? I say, oh yeah, Stiegler. Oh, okay, Stiegler's in it. Okay, well, in that case, but he was just great.
Yeah, what I noticed about if I remember the film correctly, most of the others that you interview, it's kind of traditional documentary talking heads more. But for instance, he explains the story of Epimetheus and Prometheus, but he takes a bucket, he shows you around. There's, kind of more, a tour guide, I would say.
Yeah. No. It was a great moment where it was the right time for him, I think. Yeah. And he knew he was totally open, really, when we made the film, we decided it's not going to be traditional talking, even though you say it's traditional. It's not traditional in the sense that we let them talk as long as they want.
Yeah.
And we didn't really, of course, there's some editing, but and there's a lot of editing, maybe more editing than any other film ever made. The amount of editing in that film took years, but nevertheless, we gave him the time to pursue something over a long period and try to make that cinematic. And he was the one who gave us the best chance to do that. But in Marseille, when we made the movie, we didn't know about him being in prison. At that time, it wasn't public knowledge. But he told the story over a dinner that we took him to, and so we understood the possibility of making another film existed about him, about his life. and we began to translate for research, only for research, the book, the very little book that now makes up the first half of Acting Out, that describes his transformation in prison. And that book also has a second part that is between those two tiny little books, it's a very distilled account of his political philosophy, let's say, his account of the contemporary malaise and what needs to be done. Extremely powerful for me. And at the same time that this was occurring, I began to run a performing arts school with my girlfriend, who is a dancer, mainly a dancing school for children. And a lot of what Stiegler is saying in those books is about the destruction of the relationship between the generations and the way in which this destruction involves a destruction of knowledge and desire. While I'm translating these books, and the later ones too, I'm in the dancing studio watching the transmission between the generations in a way that is very, very different from institutional schooling. And those differences have everything to do with what Stiegler was talking about. And between those events, in the constellation of that translation and that process of education that I'm observing, that very singular process of education, it became obvious to me not only that Stiegler makes a step past Derrida, as I said, which I haven't explained what I mean by that, but nevertheless, it's what I think, and is also not just a philosopher at all. He's a man who sees what's the real issue of today and sees why nobody else can see what the problem is.
Yeah.
So what is that? As I said to you, the techniques of memory that suspends the biological programs of our existence means that we have to cultivate our relationship to those artifacts, to technological objects, and our relationship to each other in technological society, or technical society. And therefore that we need intergenerational transmission to occur, and to occur with a dynamism that means that it adjusts to technical change. And mostly that happens below the surface, and then there's some kind of shock because there's a large change to the technical system, or some kind of limit is reached and things start to dysfunction. And that dysfunction becomes the dynamism of a new step in the cultivation of knowledge and ways of living. But at the same time, the techniques of memory is what Stiegler calls pharmacological, getting it from Derrida and getting it from Socrates. In other words, it can also sterilize, become dogma, it can sterilize knowledge, turn it into dogma, prevent the transformation, prevent the dynamism that needs to occur. There's no escape from this, because it's only through the techniques of memory that the possibility of taking the new step exists.
So
and this is a question of a leap.
So this point, techniques is something that allows us to take a new step, but at the same time, it also has, well, if you say pharmacological, it's like it can be a potion, it can be curative, but it can also be a poison, right?
Which was Socrates' issue about writing.
Yeah, I always think about, maybe this is too simple, but I always think about, if you give me your phone number, I write it down on a piece of paper. Because I write it down, I'm not busy with remembering it. So if I lose the piece of paper, let's say most of another more modern example is that I think most people, the phone numbers, the important phone numbers that they have, even the phone number of their wife or of their mother, are in their phone right now. So if your phone crashes, maybe you're not able to call them anymore.
Right. Well, that's exactly what Socrates says.
Not about smartphones, but about
this is why he's relevant today, and why you need Socrates today is because he did think that. Why did he think that? What made it possible for him to think that? This is a question of the sophist, of sophism. And the way we should think about it is, in ancient Greece, they had a crisis. There is what Dodds called the inherited conglomerate, which is the inherited understandings, myths, meanings of those past timeless generations suddenly starts to be called into question. And it's called into question. Why? Because writing starts to become a generalized ability. And this changes the conditions of the inheritance of that past. And it leads to all kinds of ruptures. And so, for instance, that's why you have Cleisthenes needing to reorganize how the clans, which becomes corrupt, finally convinces everybody to adopt a new system of categorization disconnected from those past generations in order to reinvigorate a system that had become stale and corrupt.
Because
but many other changes as well.
No, I guess if you the myths and the kind of educational stories that were being told at the time about how to organize society, but also about what is virtue, how you should behave in life, they're passed on through narratives, so telling stories. And right. I think every time you tell a story, you kind of adapt it. But you also, in this adaptation of a story, you also incorporate maybe more modern features. You try to, like, if I tell a story to my daughter, sometimes I try to incorporate things that happened to her during the day. So that's kind of I don't want to say natural, but there was maybe a difference in when you have a story that you tell and you can rearrange it subtly. I don't know how to say that, to fit the needs at the time. And when it's written down and it's just, that's how it is. The words are there on the paper. You don't change the words there.
It's a little bit more complicated because in fact, I think oral transmission has its own techniques.
Yeah. Okay.
And what I mean is that there can be ways of composing an orally transmitted story, saga, let's say, that is engineered in the way you speak it to function as reminders. It goes like this, then this, then this. If this has happened, then so that it's you can have incredible consistency of how you tell those stories, which might take 2 weeks to tell the story.
Yeah.
But it can get passed on with a lot of consistency, but only because knowledge of those techniques is itself cultivated and passed on. And once writing begins to dominate, then those oral techniques start to fall into disuse. And I think this is what Bartok really had a hand in discovering, just how effective these techniques could be, even and lasting even until the 20th century. But at the same time, what you're saying is true, that they're not exact, they're not perfect. They might be very good, but they're not the same thing as being able to say, I can take Plato off this shelf here,
yeah,
and it's identical to what it was 2,500 years ago, and it's not a question. So yes, this exactitude becomes the basis of okay, we have to say this. One might think that exactitude is what makes things lose their vitality. And Plato kind of said this too. Yeah. But the other side of it is that exactitude, the fact that you can repeat, you can read it again and read it again and read it again, and it's exact every time, in fact is what opens the possibility, through the fact that when I read it again, the experience that I have is not identical to the previous time that I read it. Yeah. And therefore I can notice the difference and begin to make an interpretation. And yeah. Therefore exactitude is a dynamic factor of interpretation, and not just of my interpretation compared to my previous reading, but my interpretation compared to your interpretation. So this is what produces a real crisis at the time of the polis of ancient Greece, of Socrates.
So because I still don't quite understand what you just said. I link that to when you say techniques is necessary to take a next step. So having something, let's say, inscribed in the material world allows us to come back to it and perhaps develop it further, and take a next step. I also get the part that maybe those new kind of any new technology will also have maybe a negative effect as well. Can have a negative effect, like you forget things, for instance, or you lose abilities that you had before. But why did that produce a crisis? I mean, the way you talk about it, I think it's also a political crisis, right? About how to organize society, not just a crisis from some philosophers talking to each other and they can figure something out, but something in the society changed.
Right, because what is inherited becomes able to be put in question in a precise way, and you, because you can go back to it. Yeah. It's not moving. It's still it's spatialized, and you can argue about what's being put down.
Which lawyers do, basically. I mean, that's in Plato's allegory of the cave. That's the example he uses about people, judges and lawyers and people quibbling about the law, right? About what is justice there.
Right. What's interesting about the figure of Socrates is that, on the one hand, he is the embodiment of, and the embodiment as the inaugurator of philosophy, the embodiment of calling previous assumptions into question, and to say, do we really know what we think we know? And so he's the embodiment of what I just said as a challenge to the inherited conglomerate. But at the same time, he's still in that world. This is what Stiegler wants to insist as well. He's still in that world of myths. He's still in that world of telling stories. And when it becomes necessary to really try to take a step that's difficult, that's the point at which Socrates will invoke something from myth, because he's still there in that world. And what that means is he's still there in the tragic world. In other words, the world of mortals, and not the world of everlasting souls and the ideas in another realm. So for Stiegler, it's important to make a distinction between Socrates and Plato, and to say that over the course of the Platonic corpus, the figure of Socrates that Plato describes shifts from being the one who calls into question to becoming the one who sets the new criterion of politics, say. And this is really Plato's shift. And in this way, Stiegler is following Heidegger in seeing the shift to what Heidegger will call metaphysics in Plato, but the difference is that for Stiegler, the key point is the shifting attitude towards writing.
Yeah, so in many of the early dialogue, of course, we only know Socrates through a large part through Plato's dialogues, but a lot of the early dialogues speak about what is X, what is justice, what is friendship, but they end in calling into question. But then, for instance, the one about friendship ends with, I think, oh, we have to go to our next appointment, and we don't really know what friendship is. But then the Republic, Plato's later work, which also, of course, features Socrates and the cave allegory of this podcast, that's kind of outlining how should we organize society, what is the difference between sophistry and philosophy, what is the role of the philosopher, what is the role of... so that's kind of a difference of saying, well, let's question things and maybe end our discussion with, oh, so actually we thought we knew something, but we don't. And what Plato is doing, right?
Right. And it's also where you begin to get those unsocratic ideas, let's say, about the ideas, about where the ideas are, that begin to become seen in an oppositional way, as, in the cliched presentation, of course, more complex than this, but that the ideas are more real than they're real. This kind of, which is the origin of the idealism that I talked about. And it's still a powerful idea, but it begins to be seen in oppositional terms, where the world of becoming, of change, of techniques is not real. Only the timeless world is real. And it's only in the 19th century that this really flips around. But flipping it around maintains the opposition.
Yeah, so flipping it around means that actually you're saying, no, the changing world of technology, that is more real than the ideal world. I mean, right. I think
which becomes ideology for Kant, for Marx. The German ideology is by ideology he means German idealism.
Yeah. So, sorry, not to interrupt you. You were going somewhere with so we were talking about the crisis in part through writing that was there in ancient Greece. I guess I just have a number of thoughts, so you can see which one you take to which path you take, right?
Okay.
So One thing I thought about is, okay, what if I think you write also in the introduction to the Neganthropocene that what one of the things that you want from a philosopher is that they comment on the age in which they're living, preferably, and that very much connects to Stiegler's Technics and Time, the fourth part, which I think he inserted it, and it's a lot about, actually it's about Trump, it's about 9/11, it's about he talks about those things, the post-truth world. So I think there's a difference in how we see a philosopher as philosophizing about eternal values, what is, mind, what is matter, and all those things. And how you explained it before is that Stiegler is saying, well, actually, you can only do philosophy in relation to the technical world, or the epoch or the paradigm that you live in. And this means that Marx couldn't have known all those things because he wasn't alive when the internet was there. But when the internet is there, you need to do it's the job of a philosopher to think about this, the internet, but also the newest discoveries in physics and all those kind of things. So it's kind of, that's the first part, a relationship between the philosopher and time. The other part is about, so you, in your PhD, you studied Plato's Sophist, and in the episode about flat Earth and science denial, we also talked about sophistry, which very much relates also to this volume of Stiegler about post-truth, about the idea that if we talk about techniques of speech, it's more important to convince somebody than to speak the truth. And Stiegler also talks about the courage, that what we need now is a kind of courage to speak the truth, or to be interested in the truth.
Okay, let me think how to approach this. There are a lot of people today who would say that we've thought enough. The time of thinking is over, and the time of acting has begun. And if we keep thinking any longer, then all we will do is assure the outcome, because thinking is slow and time is short. And even some philosophers will say this. And I think it's totally wrong to say that. But then it's up to me to justify that.
Yeah.
And to make an argument why we still need philosophy, and what that means, and what philosophy can do. And you have to say, to start out with, that most of what philosophy does is completely useless. And the accusations that are thrown at it are produced by its own uselessness, because it is subject to the same pharmacological characteristics as anything else, and can become stale, can become dogmatic, can become empty, can become lazy, can become simply
racist, all those kind of things. Yeah.
Just a bureaucracy, or an institution that takes care of itself, etc., etc. And one of the reasons is what you said before, that we go to the part of Technics and Time 1 that's about Heidegger, because we don't understand who are these archaeologists, and that's all. That science is far away from philosophy for me, and it's too hard. I have to stick with what I know. I've received this. In other words, the education that you receive that makes you into somebody who calls themselves a philosopher can be the very thing that narrows you because of specialization that's fundamental part of the academic system that we live in today. And nevertheless, you have to say it makes no sense to live in the 21st century and do philosophy without knowing and thinking and reflecting and taking new steps and creating new concepts in relation to science, archaeology, human evolution, technology, and the transformations that all of that has brought, not to mention politics. But politics is not enough either. Mm-hmm. It's not enough to say, I am commenting on Trump. So I have to then justify all of that, which I would do in the following way. For what I was going to say before that I didn't say is that what Stiegler argues is that because technology is really about retention, that is memory, and what retention makes possible, that is dreams and desires. And because those memory technologies are pharmacological, it's always the case that new memory technologies create new possibilities for the cultivation of knowledge, which ultimately means ways of living with the pharmaca that are artifacts and living together with other people in the world of those pharmaca and artifacts. And at the same time, destroys knowledge or produces a tendency towards the destruction of knowledge. And if this is what Socrates was saying about writing, when he said exactly as you said, that once I start to rely on writing, I stop relying on my own ability, and therefore I stop cultivating my own ability to remember, which is to say my own ability to know, then that's why Stiegler will say that Socrates was the first thinker of proletarianization. For Stiegler, proletarianization means the destruction of knowledge. And in the 19th century, there's a whole new process of the destruction of knowledge that begins to occur, and that Marx describes. And what is it? It's when the gestures of the worker are programmed into the machine. So instead of the worker knowing how to use a tool that means that they can weave, a mechanical loom takes that knowledge and turns it into information. And just as I said, the ability to understand how to use memory technologies orally disappears with writing, so too the ability to weave, etc., falls into oblivion as machines take over. Also powered by the steam engine, etc., of course. In other words, knowledge has a history, but in the 19th century, this destruction enters a new phase and becomes much more powerful. And if Stiegler says that we live in a hyper-industrial age rather than, as some people have said, a post-industrial age, it's because we have the industrialization of memory starting at that time. Now, the 19th century also is the century of the rise of the press agency and the newspaper, which for Hegel was the beginning of a modern ritual. In other words, he saw the positive side of this newspaper, which obviously has many positive sides. One of those positive sides is the development of the idea of a public of opinion, for which newspapers are a crucial tool by having writers who are cultivated in the creation of opinion. Opinion not just as a perspective, but opinion as a way of taking a position on the world. And yet, at the same time, the rise of press agencies is a rise of a new kind of market, a market in information. Information that somebody has and that is valuable to them as long as they have it and somebody else doesn't have it. Once everybody has that information, it loses its value. This is not the case for knowledge. Knowledge can be enriched by being shared. It doesn't lose value. But a newspaper that's 2 days old is completely worthless. It's worthless unless it becomes a document of some other knowledge process. But as an information repository, it loses its value very quickly. And so this 19th century is the century of the creation of a public of opinion, but also the century of a market of information. And in the 20th century and the 21st century, we can see how those tendencies develop in very powerful ways. And what we see, the problem with saying something like that people today don't rely on facts, they need to be given the facts, or we need to have a fact checker or an organization of fact checking, is it doesn't ask the question, why does this thought that we need to have a fact checker arise today? And one of the key reasons it arises today is because opinion is destroyed. There is no opinion, which means the cultivation of organs, of instruments and institutions, newspapers and so on, that have a kind of authority that means that people consider them worth the effort of investing their time in. All of that is destroyed, especially with the rise of the internet, which was disastrous for newspapers, and which forced them all to take more and more steps to take advantage of the market of information above all else. But information is totally pharmacological. Information is not the same thing as knowledge, and it's not the same thing as truth. So a fact checker is a symptom of a destruction that is itself a reactive phenomenon. And that's why fact checkers very often, in fact, themselves can become a new kind of scapegoater, because there's a third dimension to pharmacology. It's not just a question of the positive side of the pharmacon and the negative side of the pharmacon. The third dimension is the pharmakos. And so when the crisis of the polis happened, it wasn't just that there was a crisis that played out around the positive and negative sides of the pharmacon, of writing. It was also the case that a reaction to the one who was putting into question, a political reaction, arose. That meant that Socrates was condemned to drink the hemlock. In the same way today, information technologies, network technologies, computer technologies that destroy every kind of knowledge vastly more rapidly than anything Socrates could ever have dreamed of, produces crises that are not just about the positive and negative side of the pharmacon, but about the production of new kinds of scapegoats. And this is why I think it's really important to say this. In 2012 or 2013, Stiegler wrote a book called Pharmacologie du Front National, Pharmacology of the National Front. In other words, about the far-right party in France, which at that time he saw as growing, because there arose an election in which the socialists didn't get into the runoff. And this message, this book was written in part to be read by politicians and other intellectuals and representatives and blah, blah, blah. And what he said in that book was, what we must not do is make a scapegoat of the people who are attracted to scapegoats.
Yeah.
To scapegoat.
So one other example comes to mind is when Hillary Clinton called Trump followers deplorables.
Right.
So that could be an American example. And I think in the Netherlands, we had Pim Fortuyn. I don't know if you... This was one of the first, I would say Trumpist, but that's kind of, it was before Trump. But he was scapegoated, demonized by a left politician, and he was killed. He was murdered because of, well, I wouldn't say because of that, but there was a climate around that. Yeah.
It's, in other words, when you get caught up in the logic of the pharmakos, it can have all kinds of strange twists and turns. And the one key point here is that this book is one of the only ones that didn't get translated into English. I was going to translate it into English 2013, but the publisher said this book is too much about French politics.
Yeah. It's
of no interest to the rest, to the English-speaking world. It's not important to them, because it's this pharmacology of the National Front is too French.
Too local.
Yes, but it is the exact phenomenon that took over the whole world in 2016, and which could have been seen coming, and where this lesson that to scapegoat the voters who are drawn into the stupidity of scapegoating can only produce greater reactions. And it's not just a question of Hillary Clinton. The entire of the Trump presidency was a vast example of that by the media more than by anybody else. And partly because as a market of information, they had a lot to gain from that reaction and counter-reaction, and also because of the structure of the platforms through which the algorithmic technologies of the social media operate exacerbate those tendencies and exacerbate the reduction of all knowledge to the most reduced forms of information.
Yeah.
In other words, the problem that we have today, that philosophers have to have an answer to if they aren't going to be completely useless, is to propose an alternative. it means nothing to resist. Resistance is a terrible concept, a terrible word, and a terrible kind of politics, because it is the acceptance of the unchangeability of a situation from the perspective of resentment. This is impossible to produce something positive from resistance. The reliance on resistance largely comes from the incapacity of, let's say, intellectuals, who, whatever you want to call them, people on Twitter, to propose an alternative. If you haven't got an alternative to propose, you're not adding anything.
Mm-hmm.
So, from my perspective, this means that philosophy has to be the beginning of a new type of political and economic thinking, and fundamentally one that does not avoid the fact that crucial to our contemporary crisis is the proletarianization, that is the destruction of knowledge and the destruction of desire, that has continued to decimate the relations between the generations. If you can't produce an alternative politics and economics, or let's say a political economy, then you can't affect this situation.
But is this different?
Stiegler has something to say.
Yeah, but is this different from what Plato did with the Republic, where at that point he was opposed to democracy, and he proposes, as a philosopher, a different way of organizing society, which, looking back at it, I think can be called ideological, or at least by interpreters afterwards, right? So how do you do, as a philosopher, you can kind of dream up a utopia, but is this different from creating an ideology?
Okay, so let's say, what are the aspects of ideology? The aspects of ideology really are, one, the denial of the primordial technicity of our existence, which, yes, so in Republic, this is what Plato does. Two, denial of the pharmacological character of this, which is done by creating an oppositional logic and then siding with one side or the other. And three, by denying the third dimension, the relationship to scapegoating. Yes, you can say Republic is ideological text in the sense that it conforms to these three characteristics. So when you propose an alternative, what I mean is one that remains tragic in the Socratic sense, that it understands that the pharmacological character is irreducible, that you can never escape the risks of the negative tendency, the risks of producing reactions and scapegoats and resentments and so on, but that operates through the awareness of those risks to keep producing new alternatives. What does that really mean today? If you recognize that the pharmacological character of information technologies has become largely negatively pharmacological, in the sense that the foundations of an idea of truth are so undermined that people think that we live in post-truth, that knowledge of all kinds is depleted and destroyed, that all kinds of will and desire has become problematic, life has become difficult and lonely and so on, and that the technologies of calculation applied to the creation of markets has everything to do with this, then what it means is that we need a new relationship. Either you believe that we need to escape industrialization, which is the position of somebody like Theodore Kaczynski, that the only way is to destroy the whole technical system, and is the position of people who believe in some smaller scale version of that. They want to live in their own little world of safety.
Do you mean like people say, going off grid, going into a community and renouncing kind of the internet and technology? And
Yes, at least Theodore Kaczynski was consistent in his willingness to face the whole picture. Either you believe that, or you say the future for us is industrial. And if the future for us is industrial, then it's a question of the creation of a new kind of industrialization. What kind of industrialization? The key point is to remember that it's not that memory technologies destroy knowledge and desire. It's that memory technologies always have the tendency to destroy knowledge and desire, but at the same time to create it. And it's how we organize in relation to those possibilities that makes the difference. And the difference that we have to make is to reorganize our economy so that it is no longer based on remunerating the destruction of knowledge and desire. How do you do that? Nobody has the answer. I don't have the answer. Bernard Stiegler didn't have the answer. But the answer that he did have was this. No matter how short the time scale that we have in order to make that difference, what we need is a bridge between the lack of alternative that we all suffer from now and the macroeconomic transformation that would be necessary to escape from this Anthropocene. And therefore, what we need is medium-scale experiments that will be capable of generating new models and alternatives. And what the priority, the value of values, has to be that animates the creation of those experiments is the value of the production and diversification of knowledge and desire rather than their destruction. That should be the basis.
Yeah, because earlier we talked about economy. Economy is not just finance. I mean, I guess that's the capitalist idea of economy just being purely about transactions and I mean financial transactions of goods.
Look, the idea of capitalism is investment. The idea of capitalism is that by investing your time, your effort, and your money, that reward will come, right? But is that the world that we live in? Do we live in the world of investment? To a large extent, capitalism itself has fallen victim to the destruction of the knowledge and desire that's necessary in order to invest well. And what it becomes replaced with is speculation, which is not investment. And that destruction of knowledge and desire has everything to do with the destruction of the time scales of the relationship to the future.
Yeah.
So that, it's the case that a investment bank may decide to shift to a building that's 500 meters closer to the stock exchange, because the shorter wires between there and there mean that they get a thousandth of a second advantage, which is what they can exploit algorithmically. Now, on the one hand, you can make money. On the other hand, this is not a model. It functions as long as it functions until it stops.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about your old college buddy, I guess, Dominic Petman's book, Peak Libido, where he also talks about these kinds of experiments. Also, they can be kind of social experience, like a group, medium-sized group experiments. So it's not just about let's say formal organizations, but also about on the level of communities, right? Is that also what you're thinking of, or are you thinking of kind of, I would say, a top-down approach where you need to think of a kind of way of organizing society or systems, or is it something that
both? It's both. Let me say this. It's a mistake. Another opposition that it's a mistake to make is the opposition between the bottom up and the top down.
Yeah.
And it is a mistake that is made, for instance, by a lot of left movements that embrace the idea of bottom up without top down. Top down, it becomes the enemy. This can get you nowhere. What matters is the relationship between the bottom up and the top down. That's a dynamic process. And what does top down mean then? It means, for instance, peer review. It means the idea that there is a structure of authority of claims. And if we live in a post-truth world, it's because all of those top-down structures have all been invalidated together and become a source of distrust together. But without any certification process,
mm-hmm.
then you are opening up to a kind of to the kind of vacuum that used to plague communes that would run on consensus, where there's no basis for making a decision, and what ends up is a default that somebody takes power.
Yeah, because you're always operating within a power structure.
In other words, the bottom-up philosophy leads to the top-down taking power. If you treat it as an alternative, one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I'm saying, yes, it is a question of communities, definitely. But it's not only a question of listening to the people or the people getting together and doing something. Yes, that's crucial. But also it's a matter of bringing them into the possibility of trust that's necessary for any top-down process. When the conditions of trust are destroyed, you cannot do that. And so you have to cultivate that possibility. But yes, it's also a question of what Stiegler was doing was experiments that were in the community, but also involving institutions. And where both need to be transformed. And not only transformed, but then become scalable up to a larger scale.
I just want to list a few ideas because we've talked about quite a lot already, and there's some elements in your work and Stiegler's work that people don't normally connect, but that if we think about an alternative, we have to take them into account. It's the same reasoning behind people who are rightfully saying that if you want to address climate change, you also need to address social justice, for instance. So they're on different dimensions, but I think they're all kind of related. And my question to you, of course, is if we can talk about how they are related. So I would say the first, what you're saying is you speak about information and knowledge as almost information sometimes being the enemy of knowledge, which is a different idea from, I mean, people saying we live in an information society. What people need to, be informed citizens is information. We talked about in the Flat Earth episode about the idea that we don't know it doesn't work, but if people don't accept the scientific consensus, or let's say what the institutions are saying, the scientific institution, the whole debate about vaccines is that they don't have the right information, the truth, let's say, the true information. And this is also connected to a break in trust in institutions, right? Which we can also relate to kind of the new right movements, to Trump. I mean, why would post-truth is I mean, it was the word of the year in 2016, I think, by some dictionary. And of course, everybody remembers is Sean Spicer saying that the inauguration crowd at Trump's inauguration was the largest in history, period. And then Kellyanne Conway was interviewed about it, and she said, well, the journalist said, well, this is just not true, it's false. But she said, no, he just presented alternative facts. So this is one idea about post-truth, and the idea that information is what should matter, but it doesn't seem to matter. Then the other part, because now that's kind of information and knowledge, is kind of the noetic, the intellectual part of it. But we've also talked about desire, and the idea, I think, which many people recognize, is that right now we live amongst screens. And in the Neganthropocene introduction, Stiegler's book, The Neganthropocene, not the the Neganthropocene, you list 7 challenges of our age, and one of them is that the ubiquitous nature of modern screens. But of course, in Plato's allegory, like the first sentence of the chapter that Stiegler writes about it is everything is a screen. But that was already true in Plato's day. So something seems to be changing around that, around living among screens, which is connected to a kind of depletion. There's something that we need and we're not getting it anymore, and it leads to a kind of crisis. Then this is connected to the screens, of course, to technology and technological performativity, which I don't quite understand yet, but there's a different dynamic in technology and information technology, information as data, as being calculated, that is different from human society, let's say. So all of this is kind of connected under the umbrella term of we live in the Anthropocene. And the alternative, I think the name for the alternative would be the Neganthropocene, which, if we look at what is the discourse around the Anthropocene, is that precisely what you say earlier, we just need to act. The time of thinking is over. We have all the information about climate change already. We just need to act. And well, in Technics and Time 4, Stiegler says, well, there's never been a time in human history where it was so urgent to meditate, and at the same time we don't have time to meditate. Okay, so this is just a whole list of a whole range of concepts that somehow need to be connected to each other, I think, in this alternative. Am I still missing other ones, or are these kind of the ingredients that we need for the cake?
Yes, maybe we need another
I'm thinking of one. I think just one more. Maybe that's the one you're thinking, is what you called about before, the otium, the free time, the kind of the break, the I think Stiegler calls it the intermittence, the time where you're not busy with your daily life. Was that the one you're thinking of, or is there one more?
Well, I was thinking of entropy and the question of
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Anthropocene means.
Yeah.
But I think I should get to that through a roundabout way. First, I think it's important to say that the post-truth age and the destruction of trust were not created by Donald Trump. And the idea of distrust in institutions was not created by Donald Trump. He exploited a situation that had been arising for a long time. Even at the level of the most obvious facts, you go back to 1990, you go back to 2003, and the second invasion, or the invasion of Iraq. Everybody who had a brain understood that this was a complete lie that was behind this, and a lot of what has unfolded in terms of geopolitics over the last 19 years or 20 years is as a result of this lie and the precursors to that lie. But at a more general level, there are many factors that have contributed to the destruction of trust. The point is to think them. And if you think them and you don't just assign a scapegoat to them, then you cannot avoid the question of what is it about the market of information and the arrangement of information technologies and the use of applied mathematics to influence desire. I mean, what is the goal of all of these technologies? Ultimately, the goal of all of them is to influence your desire in order to change your behavior, in order to make you behave on a shorter time scale as a consumer. That's what they all are for. And they work. They work in the sense that they have created a universe of people who have more and more lost the ability to take their time, lost the ability to cultivate their desire, act on shorter time scales, and consume. But at the same time, they don't work in the sense that they don't make anybody happy. In other words, if you engage in a behavior repeatedly and more, and that behavior doesn't bring you satisfaction, except in the most instantaneous sense, what are you?
You're addicted.
You're an addict. Yeah. And the logic of all of these technologies is a logic of addiction. And in that way, it doesn't work, because addiction is not investment. And addiction is not desire. Addiction is the destruction of desire. So I think it's important to say that. What I think, and it relates to what you said about otium and the gotium. Otium is the possibility of taking the time to be able to read a book from beginning to end, or to read the score of a symphony, whatever it is.
Or look out the window and see if, something comes up or not. That has nothing to do with what you were doing before.
Or to reflect on what has happened to you in order to reflect on what you should do next and how you could do it better. The time of reflection is largely destroyed. And that's what Stiegler is saying. I said at the beginning, or near the beginning, that the behavioral programs of all living things are based on a kind of memory, And I said that that memory is genetic memory. What does that mean? It means that at a certain time, several billion years ago, a new process entered the universe. One that seems to run opposite to the overwhelming tendency of the universe, in the same way as in the Ista poem, Hölderlin says that at the source of the Ista, the water seems almost to run backwards. It almost runs backwards in the sense things almost run backwards with living things, in the sense that instead of tending to fall apart, tending to go to the simpler structures to use up their energy, the opposite seems to happen. Complexity seems to develop. Differentiation seems to increase, and energy is conserved. All of this seems to be counter to the second law of thermodynamics. And when we say that the genetic program is a memory, what we mean is it lasts over time. And by lasting over time makes possible new forms of differentiation and new forms of the lasting of this process. The lasting over time and the differentiation of organs and species that it makes possible, that this memory molecule makes possible, is what Schrödinger called negative entropy. Negative not in the sense of opposite, but in the sense of a counter tendency within the overwhelming tendency that is inescapably the entropic tendency of the second law of thermodynamics, that as applied to the universe as a whole. At a certain point, brains develop, vertebrates, and when brains develop, they produce a new kind of memory that makes possible new forms of negentropy for animals. That means that they can conserve the lessons of their experience, but they can't pass them on. And the question is, firstly, are human beings the same as animals or different? And second, are machines a type of negative entropy, or are they something else? For somebody like Simondon, the answer to this question ultimately comes down to that machines need humans, and that humans are the individuators here. In other words, there's a rank, and the machines are not really negentropic, but the humans are. On the other hand, you have somebody like Wiener, Norbert Wiener, who argues essentially that more or less machines are a kind of anti-entropic thing. What's the mistake here? The mistake is that it's not a question of this or that. It's that we are technical beings. The question is not whether humans are negentropic or machines are negentropic or negentropic as well. We are with technics. And what is negentropic for us is the dynamic relationship between us and our techniques that produces not a differentiation, not just of organs and species, biological somatic organs and species, but exosomatic organs or technical organs and idioms. In other words, localities that are not the locality of the individual organism or the locality of the ecosystem, but the locality of the village, the ethnic group, the clan, the nation, and so on, which are not species. This is because of the suspension of biological programs.
So what Simondon said is correct to say that machines need humans, but humans also need machines.
And cannot live without techniques. It's not possible for us to live without techniques any more than it's possible for a chicken to live in the wild, because a chicken is not a species. A chicken is in a relationship with artifice as well, because we've invented the chicken. So, but we have invented ourselves too, and been invented by the techniques that we invent.
And the techniques are kind of, you use the word endosomatic, I think, so exosomatic. So it's kind of, that's, I think the basic idea is that cooking is kind of externalizing a function of our metabolism. So because we can cook meat, which needs fire making, unless you're very lucky that lightning hits, you can prepare something and eat it, and your body can process it, but this is also affecting our biology. So we're not okay, let's just pause it there. Yeah,
right. And if we've said from the beginning that we have read Socrates and understand that techniques is a pharmakon, memory techniques is a pharmakon, all techniques is memory techniques, if we understand those things, and we understand that a pharmakon means that it's poisonous and curative, has a positive and a negative side, where does that ultimately come from? It comes from the fact that we cannot live by our biology alone. In other words, if we live without techniques, entropy gets us fast. Only by constantly living with instruments and artifacts can we stave off the entropy that you can never escape anyway. And so entropy and negentropy are positive and negative type tendencies as well, but they're different from the positive and negative tendencies you get of life that is not just entropic and negentropic, but technically entropic and negentropic. And what that means is, as we've said from the beginning, constantly needs knowledge of how to live with it so it doesn't destroy you. And where that instrument itself can be what destroys that knowledge, but also makes it possible as well as necessary. And this is the point I'm getting to. For Stiegler, it's necessary as a philosopher to introduce new concepts here, because we can't just say technically entropic and technically negentropic. What we have to say is Simondon ranks them and Wiener confounds them, the machine and the human being, because they're lacking concepts. And the concepts that they're lacking are what the form of entropy and negentropy when it becomes technical. And this is why Stiegler refers to that as anthropy, which in French sounds almost like entropy, and negentropy. With these concepts, you can understand what it means to say we need to make the value of values through which we produce new alternatives and new models, new economic and political models. We need to make that value of values what produces a diversification of knowledge and desire. What we really are saying is that makes negentropy the value of values in the struggle against entropy. This is the relationship between knowledge and information that he's describing in Technics and Time 4.
Yeah. So negentropy is so there. I think there's also a concept anti-entropy. I guess if human beings without techniques would be in the wild, which is not possible, but that you would just be fighting entropy, right? Which maybe you can do for a little while on a very local scale. But that's kind of fighting the tendency of entropy. That's anti-entropy. But negentropy, I think Stiegler names this example is where you go to see a film, and in a way that takes energy, but you come out and you have more energy, you have more ideas, you're inspired. So it's something that creates energy.
Well, it depends. It depends how much you want to go into all of that terminology.
Maybe not too much because
there's a mathematical biologist or biological mathematician called Giuseppe Longo, who worked with Bernard, and he has tried to formulate questions about entropy and life in a similar way, and from the perspective of to what extent is it possible to mathematize the notion of life as the struggle against entropy, which goes back to Schrödinger. And he wants to make a distinction between a machine and biological life, which is totally legitimate because that's not the same thing as making an opposition between human life and a machine. And what does he say? The difference is that life only exists in what he calls the extended critical situation. In other words, that you can't just press the off button. You can go into hibernation if you're a bear, but even if you're in hibernation, you haven't really escaped entropy. You've got a behavioral program that is very good at conserving itself against that tendency under certain conditions, but it doesn't escape. The bear is not hitting an off switch. You can hit an off switch and then turn it back on. And even though there's entropy in a machine too, but basically in reasonable timescales, it makes no difference to the machine. It's not a process. But life only exists as a constant crisis that's always unfolding. And in other words, you're always involved. Every cell of your body is always involved in that struggle against entropy at every moment.
Like we need to eat.
Right.
Or as just one example.
So there's two aspects to it. One is the conservation of what I am, not as unchanging, because I'm always changing, but as more or less stable, metastable. That could be called negentropy. And then there's the transformative character. For instance, when the biological evolution produces new things that never existed before, species that never exist, the singularity of that process in its capacity to produce transformation, to bring something into existence that the universe didn't imagine beforehand, is something like anti-entropy. So in other words, you could say it's a division between a synchronic and a diachronic aspect. And the same argument could be made about entropy and negentropy. Negentropy is in that way would be the tendency to metastabilize the psychic life, the social life that we live in, not freeze it, but to metastabilize it in a dynamic that also can produce anti-anthropic transformations when a system reaches its limits. And what does happen when a system reaches its limits? Either it collapses or it transforms.
Yeah. So that metastabilizing also, I think, means keeping things open, right? Because there's, if you close things off from, let's say, the rest of the universe, in the end, entropy will win.
And where every system always has a tendency towards closing. Yeah. And that's why the struggle, keeping it open is always a kind of a struggle.
Yeah.
And that struggle for us is what we usually call politics.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about entropy. So these are kind of still the physics aspects of it. And there's a relationship between entropy and I mean, Stiegler makes a connection between entropy, the Anthropocene. So we have the entropy with an E and with an A, and anthropos, let's say entropy, everything becomes humanized. The whole planet is kind of humanized now. We have satellites in orbit. We have, there's everything is anthropized in that way. Mm-hmm. And then he makes a connection between information. Entropy has been used in information theory, which he's very critical of. And he also introduces this concept of technological performativity. Maybe that's a good next step, because I know I'm very interested in the concept of performativity, but I didn't know technological performativity. One way of looking at performativity is if I say I promise you this, then I'm doing the thing I'm describing. So it's not just a description. So that's where it came from linguistics. Mm-hmm. But you can expand it. I think Derrida has done that as well. For instance, if you read a novel, it describes a world, but by describing that world, it also brings this world into being. So if I connect it this way to technology, then I would say that something like the smartphone or an internet or something, it creates a world in which it functions. So there's not a default world there and then you introduce a technology, but actually by introducing a technology, it also changes the world or the society. Like maybe the technology of writing transformed a society in which writing becomes very important.
Right. Well, this is a character from the beginning. And what makes it hard to recognize from the beginning is firstly the fact that change is so slow, but also the fact that it's very hard to see that it's a dynamic between the organisms that we are and the technical organs that we create. And this is what I was trying to describe with the idea of a mirror. It's what happens between the mirror and the one who sees themselves into the mirror. Because if I carve a piece of flint and then I look at it, I'm looking at myself. Mm. And if I pick up a piece of flint that was carved 50,000 years ago and I look at it, I'm looking at us. And I can recognize us somehow. And the question is, when can I recognize us? At what point can I say that it is us? Is the one who created a tool 1 million years ago us yet, or is it not yet us? Mm-hmm. However you answer that question, what has already begun 1 million years ago is that dynamic, which is why I say everything happens in the between space, between the brains and the nervous systems and the organism and the artifact. There's a dynamic unfolding, and to say that there's a dynamic means that it's performative, that it's not just that I decide to do this and then somebody else decides. There's an unfolding dynamic that's let's say a psychotechnic dynamic, a psychosocial technique dynamic of individuation that is constantly reinventing the world, but mostly without being known. But that's the let's say aporia of decision. It's nothing but the sum of all decisions, but we are not the authors of our decisions alone. All of our decisions are because we are responding to a dynamic that we are already in, that we are already born into. And this is why you need Heidegger, because he understands that our past is what is already running ahead of us, that we have to grow into through adopting that past. And adopting it means transforming it, blah, blah, blah. You need your Heidegger you need being in time. And
so decisions are always decisions about something. You're always in a situation where you make a decision.
We're in an extended critical situation in the same way as Longo describes for life, but in our case, that extended critical situation is a technical situation and a different kind of local situation in the sense that it's idiomatic to this locality, this nation, but then becomes the generator of another process, which is globalization, which is a delocalization process. And it's that delocalization process of globalization, which is also the expansion of the Western individuation process to the whole planet, that produces the Anthropocene.
So just to tie it to one more idea, that the decision is always about, in a way, about the state of facts, like the past, the situation that I'm in, but a decision also involves maybe what you referred a kind of a dreaming, an imagination of something. For instance, if I decide, shall I stay, eat in or go out for dinner tonight, I'm imagining two possibilities. And these possibilities you have to be able to imagine these possibilities. This is something that Judith Butler says about performativity in the context of gender, that you need to be able to imagine or conceive of a possibility in order to act. So you cannot do an action. One idea I have, for instance, in the time of Plato, you could think about, well, why didn't slaves want to vote at that time? I think it's probably in that time it would be very hard for a slave to even conceive of the possibility to vote, and it not being more ridiculous than a dog voting or something. Well, now in the Netherlands we even have the Party of Animals that is fighting for the rights of animals. So,
in other words, imagination and dreaming, which is also to say desiring, anticipating, etc., have their conditions. And those conditions are technological. And to say that something has conditions is not to say that it's determined, but it has conditions. And what are the conditions of imagination? So if we think back to what we said about idealism many hours ago, for Kant, our relationship to the world depends on the schemas through which we apprehend imaginative as a kind of imagination. The schematisms of the imagination. But those schematisms are not transcendental as Kant thought. They have conditions that are not transcendental, and that mean that they change over time. They can last for a very, very long time, but they change, and that's why it's significant that Kant is writing under the influence of Newton and the idea that the Cartesian division of time and space is a scheme of the imagination that will last forever. And then we find out, well, maybe time and space are not quite what we thought. They're not Euclidean at all. Anyway, but nonetheless, we could also say the schema of the imagination that gives us the geometrical point, which is the foundation of geometry, and which does not exist. It's a kind of dream as well. There is no geometric point. We only dream it, but we dream it together collectively, and it lasts a very long time and maybe lasts for all time, but it's still an idealization. In other words, the dynamic has material conditions, but that dynamic still produces idealizations, dreams that are what we call knowledge, that produces the possibility of introducing into the universe things that change the rules of how it operates. the game that we play has the possibility of introducing new things that change the rules of that game. You can't change the rules of physics, but you can change the rules of the relationship to the second law of thermodynamics.
So is that what you meant with what a job of a philosopher would be at least at this moment? Because pretty much everyone agrees that if we go on as a species the same way, then it will not look good. So we need to conceive of a kind of a new future. It also means that we need to introduce something new, but at the same time,
everybody will say that. Every exactly. Philosopher, whoever, if they want to sound wise, they say we need the new, we need the possibility of blah blah blah, and then that's the full stop. That's where they end the paper. That's where the book comes to an end. And then what? Then they write the next book. There's the same thing. What is missing there? What's missing is that either they're materialists or they're idealists or whatever. They can't think the performativity of that dynamic. That means the question is, how do you nudge that dynamic in the direction that you want? And you nudge it, not just, you need concepts, which are kind of techniques. You need the concepts that will make it possible for you to reinvent the technical and industrial future. And for Stiegler, those concepts are ultimately, at the end of his career, entropy and negantropy, where entropy is never able to be overcome, but it's the constant struggle, and entropy as well, of course. But we're constantly in the struggle against the tendency for knowledge to turn into information. And what we need is, if we say, everybody knows we have to change because climate change, blah, 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 but yet nobody's doing anything, nothing happens. It's because of power, invested interests, etc. Yes, it is because of power, invested interests, but that's not all that it's because of. It's also because of post-truth. It's because the conditions of our capacity to believe in a future and to trust in some trajectory to get to that future have been totally undermined. And the relationship to truth then is what makes it really a philosophical question. As long as you recognize that truth has its conditions, and those conditions are what we do with our memory technologies, which are also our dream technologies.
Yeah, and I would add it's not just the possibility to get there, but the possibility to get there together, because that has been eroded as well. The community, the sense of we, where I think we're I can't remember his name. This famous physicist in the 1980s. Anyway, I think what is his name? Like a public physicist. Sorry,
Carl Sagan.
Carl Sagan. Yeah, he already said. I think it was already in the 80s where he said, "Okay, look, here's the problem: climate change. But this can only happen if we can only face this if we're able to work together, not just the United States, but all these different nations. And if we don't learn that, if we don't have this sense of a community, of we need to get there together, this kind of is doomed from the start."
Right. Well, it's the decade where Margaret Thatcher said there is no such thing as society, and Ronald Reagan said the problem is the government is the problem, not the solution. Yeah. So this is really the decade in which the active attempt to destroy all of the systems through which we try socially to find ways of living with our changing technical system were begin to really be undermined in a very powerful way that's continued for the last 40 years. That's the story of the last 40 years.
And what is it? Because then, given what we've talked about before, we're not at the steering wheel in the sense that we can just draw up a new ideology. You said before, what is the next is maybe we don't know, which is maybe a great, like an end of a Socratic dialogue about, okay, many of the assumptions and the way we approach things are not working, and we need something new. That is what we know, but we don't know what it is. And you've been engaging, spending so much time and energy in the work of Stiegler, translating it, I think making it available. I think you're not in it for the money, right? I mean, actually your book, Political Attraps,
For political anaphylaxis.
yeah, so
it's
available open source. Yeah, sorry.
Why are you struggling? That title just rolls off the tongue.
Yeah, I don't know. I need to say it like 10 times. But so given what we talked about, you invest energy in a work also maybe with a sense of critique, but also because of a desire. So what is it that you feel is the importance of this work? I mean, maybe I should ask another question first, because it's so difficult. Stiegler's work is so difficult to read. He introduces so many neologisms, new concepts, axiomatization. I counted the sentence of like 177 words. I think in society there's a lot of critique sometimes. If let's say public philosophers, if they write in a difficult way, there's the question, it's just posing, because it should just be simple. So my first question would be, why is it so difficult? And the second question is like, is there a way that you can translate this? I mean, you're translating it literally, but is there a way that you can translate it in a way that makes clear, why do we need to invest our time in trying to understand this work?
Right. A few things. First thing, Jacques Derrida, that I mentioned before, in a book called Limited Ink, said, if things were simple, word would have got around. The problems we have are complex. A tweet is not going to solve it. And the fact that the intellectual class, if you want to call it that, becomes captured by Twitter is one reason for thinking that it's a worse platform than Facebook, if such a thing is possible. But to go back to Stiegler's work, yes, it's complicated, and he has some very long and complex sentences. I don't believe the problem is neologisms. Yes, there's lots of neologisms, and the problem is that you have to, all of the ones from the earlier books are kept and new ones are introduced as the work unfolds. So yes, there's a proliferation of neologisms. Some of them mean almost the same thing as the old ones. So you can definitely ask, was it really necessary to do this particular one or that particular one? And it's inevitable that people will ask themselves that question. But I would say two things. One is, when you're a genius, you have to do it your way. That's the first thing. And Bernard Stiegler was a genius. His brain was just, it was there. It was all there. I don't know when it exactly happened, but I think it was when he was in that prison cell. Something crystallized, and after that, it was just a matter of pulling it out of his head. The second thing is, I've already said why I think neologisms are necessary, because they mark places where a concept is missing.
In a sense, all our words were neologisms at one point in human history.
Yeah. But there are problems with the fact that his work is difficult. But one of the main ones is the one that I said, that the people who you might think are qualified to read it struggle because their reading is too narrow. And that's for a lot of reasons. One is because it's for superficial reasons, because it's cool for them to be experts in this narrow thing, and then there are other reasons. But it makes no sense to have that narrowness today if you accept that we have to address very complicated aspects of our contemporary crisis that involve all kinds of science of climate change and so on, but also and fundamentally our relationship to knowledge and truth and desire. And that knowledge, truth, and desire are fundamental to philosophy, but they're not able to be understood really only within philosophy. You need philosophy plus.
Yeah. So you need anthropology, and you also need physics.
And archaeology and engineering. You need, and psychoanalysis. You need many, many things. And the risk is, and this is something I've thought about a lot since Bernard died, that at the moment when somebody has the courage and the will to take that step past just philosophy and to construct a work that really can give us important signs about where we need to go, at that moment, it could also be the case that there's nobody left capable of reading or digesting. And that's what we could call a more than tragic fate for philosophy, but also for far beyond philosophy.
And what is next for you? What are you working on right now?
Well, I'm in the hiatus that was created by Stiegler's suicide, which happened in the pandemic, as you know, and it's been catastrophic in a lot of ways for me personally and generally. So it's been busy, and for instance, I translated the whole of Technics and Time 4, which was a manuscript that Stiegler sent to some people in 2017. But whether or not that can ever be published is something that I don't know. I also translated the book he wrote on Nietzsche, and part of the sequel to that book, which was the final book that he wrote, called The Lesson of Greta Thunberg, who was very crucial at the end of Bernard's life. He changed the name of the organization that he is connected with to reflect that. And also have published, all those ones are not published, no contract, nobody can read them, that's it. But I did publish the collective book that was in some way Bernard's final testament, even after the Thunberg book, which is called Bifurcate, There Is No Alternative, the subtitle being an ironic twist on the 80s ideas of Thatcher and Reagan. And that is the book in which most concretely fleshed out is the ideas about what steps have to be taken in what direction. So hopefully people will read that book.
No. I'm just left with, how can it be that, in my humble opinion, one of the greatest philosophers that was alive until very recently, who has, in maybe one of the greatest problems that humanity has ever faced, I wouldn't go so far to say that it's the solution, but I think there's so much in there that people can either use as an inspiration, or they can use it as a point of critique, because I don't agree with everything he writes, but the way he writes about things allows you to form your own thoughts about it. And which is so urgent and so timely. How can it be that his work is not widely known as, let's say, Kant's work in his day, and at the same time it sounds like there's a lot of unpublished work, a lot of work that needs to be translated, which would be which could help our current situation, I think. I don't expect you to answer this question, but it's
a real question. It's nobody can deny it's a genuine. Well, nobody who agrees with what you're saying, like me, can deny that it's a genuine question. Well, maybe we just have to say there are not enough podcasts about it.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great way to end this part and say that maybe in the future we will talk about it more.
Yeah. Well, in that case, just let me say that thank you again very much. Or I didn't actually say it at the beginning, but thank you very much for having me on and for pursuing questions a long way and giving a chance to really flesh out some things. It's rare, and it's great when that happens. So I really appreciate it.
Thanks. That's great to hear. Thank you for listening. If you want to know more about Daniel's and Stiegler's work, I listed books in the description that you can download and read for free. I also recommend renting or buying the Ister on Vimeo. If you have any questions about what we discussed today, send me a message. Go to livefromplatoscave.com for other episodes and ways to support this podcast. I hope to see you again soon.